OnlyFans hookers and homosexual marriage and stuff like this. Why is that stuff we have to deal with again? The hell are we importing Muslims here for anyway? We don't need them here. Never needed them here. Diversity is our strength. Has not been a strength having Muslims here.
Why do you hate leftists?
Because they're psychopaths who are going to destroy everything that I care about through suicidal empathy.
That was Andrew Wilson. Over the past year or so, he's gone from being a relatively niche figure in the online debate space to one of its most watched and most discussed personalities. He hosts a YouTube channel called The Crucible, where he debates pretty much anyone who's willing to come on, and he runs an associated online program called Debate University, which promises to teach his viewers how to argue the way he does. He's appeared on Jubilee, The Whatever Podcast, Joe Rogan, Piers Morgan, and his clips travel widely on social media, where they tend to get framed as Wilson destroying his interlocutor of the day. Most recently, Wilson sat down for a long-form interview on Triggernometry, a popular politics and culture podcast hosted by the British comedians Konstantin Kisin and Francis Foster. And the interview is, in many ways, a useful one. It's not a hostile cross-examination, but it's not a total softball either. The hosts do raise objections at certain points, and the format gives Wilson room to lay out his worldview at length and in his own words. So if you want a pretty comprehensive presentation of Wilson's views, this interview is a good place to start. What's striking while watching it is the manner in which Wilson presents what are, by any reasonable measure, extreme views. He's calm, he speaks slowly, he brings up ethical foundations. The whole performance is meant to convey that what you're hearing is not just vibes, but serious philosophy. A worldview that has been carefully thought through, and that can be defended at any level you'd care to challenge it on. That, anyway, is the impression. The question I'll be taking up is whether the impression survives contact with the actual arguments. So in what follows, I'm going to walk through the main claims Wilson makes in the Triggernometry interview and examine how well the reasoning behind them holds up. Spoiler alert, not very well. But I want to take the arguments seriously enough to show why they don't hold up, rather than just dismissing them. Let's get into it. The foundation of Wilson's understanding of politics is a dichotomy, though he prefers the more impressive-sounding term dialectic, between two worldviews. On one side, you have the right. On the other, the left. And the difference between them, on Wilson's telling, is not so much a disagreement over policy. More deeply, it's a disagreement over metaethics. In particular, a disagreement over whether morality is even real.
The left-wing pillar is based around anti-realism, anti-moralism. So that's why you end up with postmodernism and many of these other philosophies which come from left-wing liberalism. Those aren't coming from right-wingers, those are coming from left-wingers.
The right, on his account, holds that there are stance-independent moral truths, facts about right and wrong that hold regardless of what anyone happens to think or feel about them. The left, by contrast, is supposedly grounded in the opposite, in what he calls anti-realism and anti-moralism. Leftists, in his telling, don't believe that morality is real. They think it's all socially constructed vibes, with no objective foundation at all.
The right is saying there's universality with morality. It's not just stance dependent, it's stance independent. The reason that they get so upset with the left is because they perceive them as doing things which are horrendously immoral. But from the left stance, they're like, well, but it's all stance dependent, so I can't be doing anything immoral.
Now you might wonder whether Wilson is actually committed to this framing in its strongest form. Maybe when he speaks of the left's anti-moralism, he just means the most extreme postmodern types, the people who would explicitly endorse the view he's describing. That'd be a much more modest claim, and a much more defensible one. But Wilson doesn't restrict himself to it. He clarifies that he sees no meaningful distinction between progressives and leftists, and that across the board, they lack any ethical foundation. So we should take him at his word. He's saying this about essentially the entire left.
Do you mean progressives or do you mean leftists?
Both.
Like the entire left?
I consider the delineation of the threshold minute.
Because?
Because when you really get into the granularity, it's all about ethics, and they don't have any. And so because there's no ethical foundation, all you're talking about is degrees of psychopathy.
And once we take him at his word, the framing is just empirically wrong. A huge percentage of left-leaning people believe in objective moral facts. They believe that slavery was actually wrong, not just that they happen to disapprove of it. They believe that cruelty is actually wrong, not just unfashionable. If you simply go and ask them, this is what many or most of them will say. For example, the Phil Paper survey of professional philosophers, a group whose politics are dominated by the left, finds strong majority support for moral realism. So it seems that Wilson's foundational framing, the framing that so much of his worldview is supposed to flow from, runs immediately into a wall of people who hold the worldview that he declares they don't. But there's a deeper problem too, and it's one that recurs throughout the interview. Wilson is treating meta-ethics, particularly the abstract question of whether moral facts are stance-independent, as if it were essentially the same thing as political philosophy. As if your answer to "are moral facts stance-independent" determines your answer to "should gay people be allowed to marry?" These are very different levels of inquiry. Meta-ethics doesn't pick out left versus right, any more than it picks out vanilla versus chocolate. You can be a moral realist and a progressive. You can be an anti-realist and a conservative. The categories simply don't track each other the way Wilson wants them to. Turning aside from the meta-ethical framing, Wilson says that ideology is a race for power. May the best ideology win. And he immediately follows this up by saying that if Christians don't win, non-Christians will.
And so now it's a race for power. It's may the best ideology win. And from my view, if it's not Christians who win it, then it's going to be somebody else who wins it, and Christians going to be ruled by whoever that is, or whatever ideology that is.
A few things to note here. First, it's unclear whether Wilson is properly distinguishing between Christianity as a personal religion and Christianity as a political program. To what extent our political leaders are Christians does not, on its own, tell us much about how the country will be governed, since Christians themselves vary enormously in their political orientation, from very conservative to very liberal. Christianity wins is not a single political outcome. It's not even a single political coalition. Second, one might wonder why Wilson believes that his ideology should win this race for power that he has in mind. The answer he proposes is that even for secular people, societies run by Christian ethics have the best outcomes.
Christian ethics, even if you don't believe it, let's say, I'm not a Christian, I don't believe in any of that nonsense. What you should believe, though, is in outcomes. And the outcomes of Christian ethics, even on secular society, are the best outcomes. So if that's the case I would make for why I think Christians should be in charge of basically everything.
But then Kisin pushes back.
What you're talking about is dominance by one group over everybody else, because we've got a better view, right? Yeah. That's what's depressing to me.
Why is that depressing?
Because, like I say, in most societies, there's a recognition. It might be tribal societies. There's the Pashtuns and the blah, blah, blahs, right? The countries that do well are the countries where those different interests are regulated through some kind of peacemaking mechanism at the level of politics. That's what politics is for, really, right?
Wilson's response is revealing. At first, he gestures at openness to accommodating other beliefs.
Whereas the country...
It doesn't need to be exclusionary, though. Just because one particular ideology holds the brackets of most of the power doesn't mean that it has to be exclusive or that it can't in some way accommodate other sections of society.
But when Kisin asks the obvious follow-up, namely, how are you going to accommodate the population of San Francisco when you're in charge? Wilson's answer is this.
Well, I mean, tell me, how would San Francisco die off if you stop letting gays get married there? It's not going to.
This is, of course, a dodge of the question. Kisin asked how Wilson would accommodate a population whose values he wants to override. Wilson's answer is more or less that they'd survive having their values overridden. In other words, his preferred policies would not kill the people with different values from his. A very low bar for a political program, and certainly one that falls short of accommodation in any meaningful sense. So we have the framing. Meta-ethics maps onto politics. The left has no ethics. Ideology is a race for power, and Wilson's side should win. But what does the dominance of his view actually look like in practice? Let's begin with one of the major domains where he applies it, namely sexual ethics. In this part of the interview, Wilson refers to Destiny, the openly bisexual streamer, to express his disapproval of same-sex activity.
How do you tell Destiny that it's immoral that he sucked 50 dicks? How do you do that? If it's the case that that's not a moral fact. How? Well, you can't.
But then Kisin asks Wilson a direct question.
Why is it that you think he shouldn't suck dicks?
Because I said so.
Now, on its face, that's an extraordinary thing to say for someone who claims to be a moral realist. Moral realism holds that moral facts are stance independent, that they hold regardless of what any particular person thinks or wants. Because I said so is almost by definition the opposite of moral realism. It's a stance-dependent answer, if there ever was one. In fairness, Wilson tries to follow up before he gets cut off by Kisin, and some of the things Wilson goes on to say later in the segment suggest that he has in mind some kind of meta point, perhaps gesturing at the idea that the opponent has no better answer than "because I said so," such that the demand for justification was somehow misplaced. But even on this charitable reading, the claim suffers from the underlying confusion we saw earlier, namely the mixing up of meta-ethics with applied ethics. To take his view a bit further, Wilson argues that gay marriage should be outlawed. At one point, he seems to be running a kind of reductio against his opponents. The structure is, once you accept that gay couples should be able to marry, you have no principled basis on which to oppose gay polygamy.
If you come to me and you say gays should be allowed to get married, and I just ask you back, why can't 3 of them get married? What's your answer to that? What is it?
Okay, and? Wilson is treating gay polygamy as if it were a self-evidently terrible outcome. He just gestures at it as if its badness were obvious. The trouble is that, for anyone who doesn't already share his framework, it's not at all obvious. Kisin, for his part, presses Wilson on this exact point. Why exactly would gay polygamy be bad?
If you're going to say 3 men can get married, then you need to be able to say 1 man can marry 3 women.
Why?
Because tell me that what argument could you possibly have against it if you allow one and not the other?
Again, okay. What's supposed to be the problem with 1 man marrying 3 women? Is it that such a practice would skew the sexual marketplace and that we'd have tons more incels? Because if so, that's a point one could certainly debate from various angles. But Wilson doesn't actually say if it's what he has in mind. He's running a chain of reductios, but he never quite lands on the thing that's supposed to be obviously unacceptable. The closest he comes to explaining it is when he speaks of an erosion of the moral character of our culture, a culture that is supposedly grounded in Christian ethics, and how cultures grounded in Christian ethics lead to the best outcomes for everyone.
It would erode the moral character of the very thing you're trying to preserve, which is your culture. But your whole culture is founded on Christian ethics, and the outcomes of Christian ethics, even on secular society, are the best outcomes.
Unfortunately, he never clearly specifies just what these outcomes are, or precisely how allowing things like gay marriage and polygamy would deteriorate them. So the argument he offers in this section seems, at best, incomplete. Wilson is also strongly opposed to pornography.
Well, how's society worse because 18-year-olds can't show their ass on OnlyFans? Like, I honestly want to hear, how's it worse? Like, it seems to me like by every metric, it's way better.
There are, in fact, several plausible answers to this. First, there's the risk that banning pornography on Wilson's grounds would pose to freedom of expression more generally. Once you've accepted that the state can ban a category of expression on grounds of moral disapproval alone, you've conceded a principle that has implications well beyond OnlyFans. Supposing, for example, that the state went on to ban all violence from film, TV, and video games on grounds of moral disapproval, it'd be much more difficult than it otherwise would to raise a principled objection to this. There's also the fact that, for some people, such as people with disabilities, people in remote areas, or people who for any number of reasons have a hard time meeting their sexual needs through other channels, banning pornography and other kinds of sex work would plausibly be a meaningful loss. Further, there's the question of whether prohibition of an existing market actually succeeds in eliminating that market, or whether it just pushes it underground in ways that make it more dangerous for the people involved. Of course, none of these answers are knockdown. Each can be debated, but Wilson presents the question as if no plausible answer is even available. The closest he comes to anticipating and engaging with an objection is when he brings up that some people would find his view totalitarian.
And the people arguing against it are like, well, we don't want totalitarianism. That's totalitarianism? I'll tell you what I saw as totalitarianism was COVID checkpoints, potential vaccine mandates, communications going through Facebook and the government to identify people who wouldn't wear their mask. That seems like a lot more of this totalitarianism, fascism thing than like, oh, sorry, you're 18, you can't put your all over the internet. Sorry.
This is classic whataboutism. The fact that other people have supported policies, such as vaccine mandates, that one considers totalitarian, does nothing to help defend one's own proposed bans. Even if one is right that the other policies in question are totalitarian, it could very well be that one's own proposed bans are likewise totalitarian. Wilson then offers what looks like a more substantive move. Specifically, he says that all laws are informed by some ethical worldview. So the question isn't whether to legislate morality, the question is whose morality to legislate.
We're a nation of laws, and laws are governed by ethics. Like it or not, all laws are informed by a person's ethical worldview. So which ethical worldview you want to make the laws? The people who want 18-year-old girls to put their assholes on OnlyFans, or the people who don't?
This is, in one sense, quite plausible. One could argue that just about any law has some ethical principle standing behind it. Even laws against murder, for example, might be argued to presuppose that murder is wrong. So perhaps there's a thin sense in which we cannot help but legislate morality. But Wilson is doing a bit of a Mott and Bailey here. The thin claim, namely that ethics inevitably enters the picture in some way, is relatively unobjectionable. The thicker claim he's actually using it to defend, namely that there's no principled distinction between, say, laws against violence and laws against consensual private transactions between adults, does not follow at all. An opponent can readily grant that ethics enters into law in some minimal sense, while also maintaining that there's value in not legislating one's full ethical worldview into the lives of one's neighbors, who might reasonably have arrived at different ethical worldviews of their own. The classic distinction here is something like the Rawlsian one between matters of justice, which the state can address via public reason, and matters of the good life, which the individual should be free to decide privately. You don't have to be a card-carrying Rawlsian to think that such a distinction is doing real work. So when Wilson gestures at how all laws are informed by a person's ethical view, he's smuggling in a highly contestable claim under the cover of a much less contestable one. Now, around this part of the interview, the discussion turns to rights. In particular, Foster asks Wilson about freedom of speech, and brings up the example of how, around the mid-20th century, Christians wanted to censor the sexually explicit novel by D.H. Lawrence, Lady Chatterley's Lover. If freedom of speech is part of your value system, but your tradition has historically been on the side of suppressing speech, what do you make of that? Wilson's response is that rights, including the right to free speech, are mere social constructions.
What is a right? Let's start with that. What is it?
You tell us.
Well, it's a social construction that we made the fuck up. That's what a right is. If it's something else other than that, tell me what it is. Where is it? I can't see it, touch it, taste it,
So it's the
smell
social construction that you have a right not to be forced to wear a mask.
Yeah. Why? What else would it be?
Now, you might have noticed that Wilson's argument that rights are mere social constructions is in tension with his earlier insistence that there are stance-independent moral truths. After all, stance-independent moral truths are arguably also things you can't see, hear, or touch. They're not the kind of thing that you can run into on the street. If intangibility is what shows rights to be mere social constructions, then moral truths more generally would likewise be mere social constructions, and hence not stance-independent, but stance-dependent. Wilson can't have it both ways. Wilson goes on to spell out his theory of rights more fully in terms of force.
You have a right to do whatever you can do within the purview of force. And that's it. You have rights because people use force to ensure that you have rights. And the second people don't ensure that there's force used so that you have rights, you don't have them anymore.
So Wilson's view is, in effect, there are no moral rights. There are, at most, legal rights. And even those reduce to de facto rights, the rights you actually have because someone with sufficient force is willing to back them up. Now watch what happens next. Around this point, Wilson pivots to attacking the atheist. The atheist, he says, can't ground rights in anything, since on the atheist's view, rights can't come from God.
The atheist mind or the non-religious mind, they can't ground rights in anything. They made them up. So they don't come from God. They just made them up. Rights only exist as some kind of like bizarre social construct if they're not grounded in God. How does a secular society uphold rights? How?
But Wilson has just conceded that rights, even on his view, are mere social constructions. He's also already on record saying that rights only exist insofar as someone with force backs them up. By his own logic, his view and the atheist's view should be on perfectly equal footing here. Both can ground rights in whoever happens to be willing to use force to uphold them. It's not as if this is an avenue that's any less open to the atheist than it is to Wilson, since atheists too generally believe that force exists. It's at this point that Kisin pushes back a bit.
But how do you uphold your right not to have to wear a mask in the middle of a pandemic through scripture or God.
In response, Wilson essentially concedes the point. He drops the divine grounding and falls back on force.
You would still utilize it through force.
Right.
The scripture doesn't prevent you from utilizing force. With this idea of like Christian pacifism and Christians being put, I don't know where that came from.
Notice the misdirection here. Wilson is acting as if Kisin had challenged him with, if you're a Christian, you can't use force to uphold rights. But that wasn't the challenge. The core of the challenge, at least if understood charitably, was, what is it about Christianity that leaves you in any better a position to account for rights than the atheist? If you're going to propose grounding rights in force rather than scripture, why can't the atheist ground rights in precisely that way as well? Wilson never addresses this. He talks about whether Christians can use force to ground rights, when the really pressing question for his view is whether atheists can do the same thing. Unfortunately, Kisin and Foster don't press this point, but instead get pulled into a different conversation about the teachings of Jesus. There's one more rights-related exchange that's worth flagging, because it shows the pattern very clearly. Returning to the censorship issue, Foster proposes a reason why censoring a book like Lady Chatterley's Lover would be wrong.
I believe that artistic creation is one of the ways that the human being expresses itself.
In response, Wilson challenges this framing.
Makes sense to me. Notice how you caveated that with I believe? Mm-hmm. Well, I don't believe that. Now what? Now where are we? The point I'm making to you is not that I would outlaw this book, right? The point that I'm making to you is that you don't have any justification for me not to.
Let's take this on its own terms. The point seems to be that Foster can't justify an opposition to censoring the book, and that this is because he can't put forth an anti-censorship rationale that would compel even a committed censor. But that's a strange standard to hold Foster to. Foster's job in this kind of disagreement is not to come up with a justification that would compel even a deeply committed opponent. His job is to come up with a justification that he himself would be rational to find adequate. A justification that he, as a thoughtful person, can reflectively endorse. The fact that a committed opponent refuses to be moved by it doesn't show that the justification fails. It just shows that a committed opponent is, well, committed. For a comparison, a person who believes the Earth is round can offer plenty of justification for that belief. That a devout flat earther refuses to accept any of those justifications on the ground that he believes they're all hoaxes and illusions doesn't show that the round earther is unjustified. It just shows that the flat earther is recalcitrant. The presence of a sufficiently stubborn opponent is not a defeater for one's own justification. Unfortunately, this point doesn't get made in the interview. Instead, Kisin steps in and appeals to democracy, saying, in effect, that we settle this kind of disagreement by voting, which doesn't really get to the heart of the issue. As Wilson rightly points out, you could, in principle, get people to democratically vote to ban the book. Democracy is a procedure for resolving disputes. It isn't by itself a guarantee that the outcome is morally correct. So the deeper question, namely, what makes an anti-censorship rationale a good one, even though one's interlocutor can refuse to accept it, gets dropped. Which is, frustratingly, where a lot of these arguments end up. Wilson maneuvers his interlocutor into a corner that the interlocutor could escape from with a little philosophical clarity, but then the conversation moves in a different direction before the clarity arrives. The interviewers don't spend that much time discussing education, but they do touch on a question worth addressing. At one point, Foster suggests that evolution should be taught in schools, and that parents should not be able to opt their kids out of learning it, since evolution is a proven scientific fact. He and Wilson then get into an exchange.
So you're saying, well, this is a scientific fact, so kids need to learn it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So parents say, well, I dispute this fact, right? I'm not going to teach my kid evolution. How does that hamstring the kid exactly? Like what about that's going to hamstring the child?
Well, maybe they want to be a scientist. Maybe the way that they see the world, you're actually taking out a fundamental part of their understanding of the world and how it works.
That's a strictly materialistic view, and it's silly.
Is it?
What about the ideas of metaphysical accounting for metaphysical things, like the laws that are immaterial, the laws of logic, things like this?
I think they should be taught in school as well.
I don't understand. They're not proven facts.
I see a few problems here. First, accepting evolution does not commit you to a strictly materialistic view. Plenty of people accept evolution and also believe in non-physical entities, such as souls, abstracta, and the laws of logic. Theistic evolutionists, for example, accept both evolution and the existence of God. The view that evolution entails materialism is about as unserious a philosophical claim as it's possible to make. So Wilson, in describing Foster's view as strictly materialistic, is simply strawmanning him. Second, look at the structure of Wilson's response. Foster was making a sufficient conditions claim, not a necessary conditions claim. He was saying important and well-established scientific facts should be taught in school. He wasn't saying that such facts are the only things that should be taught in school. The two claims are very different. When Wilson asks, what about the laws of logic? What about metaphysics? He's treating Foster as having denied that anything else should be taught, which Foster never did. So here again, Wilson scores a rhetorical hit against a position no one is holding. Near the end of the interview, the subject turns to women's suffrage. It's here that Wilson argues against women's right to vote. One argument he offers for this is that women are not subject to the draft. The thought seems to be that voting and being eligible for the draft are linked. If you don't share in the obligation, you shouldn't share in the privilege.
I've never seen a great reason why women should be able to vote, because they can vote to send men to war that they themselves do not have to go fight. They are not beholden to the draft. Only men are.
However, if you really think there's a problem with one sex being subject to the draft and the other not, the response need not be to take voting away from women. You could instead simply propose extending the draft to women, making the obligation as universal as the privilege. For Wilson to complete his argument, he would need to show that disenfranchising women is a superior option to simply including women in the draft. But Wilson goes on to give a further argument against women's suffrage.
You cannot erode or get rid of the patriarchy because you always have to appeal to it for your rights. And that's a fundamental truth. If you always have to appeal to one sex for your rights, right, then why are you being imbued with the responsibility of that at all? Because women have to appeal to men for their rights, and anytime men want to take rights away from women, they can, like that. And there's not a damn thing women can do about it.
The underlying picture here is the same force-based theory of rights we've already encountered. Rights, on Wilson's view, exist only insofar as they're backed by force. Women, on average, cannot physically defend their rights against men. Therefore, the argument goes, women's rights are always parasitic on men's willingness to back them up. And if your rights are parasitic on someone else, you really shouldn't be doing the voting. The people actually doing the work of maintaining the political order should. There are a number of problems with this line of reasoning. First, consider where the argument generalizes to if you take it seriously. Lots of groups can't physically defend their own rights against larger or stronger groups. The physically handicapped, by and large, cannot, nor can the elderly. In fact, just about any minority group, by its very nature, couldn't physically defend itself against the majority, were the majority to turn against it. If your principle is voting privileges should track the capacity to back up your rights with physical force, then you've just suggested, on the same principle, that disabled people, the elderly, and pretty much every minority group shouldn't get to vote either. The point bears stressing. The same principle Wilson is appealing to for denying women the right to vote would have justified never extending voting rights to racial minorities in the United States, such as Black Americans. As a minority, Black Americans could not, at any point in American history, have prevailed by force against the white majority. On Wilson's principle, that would be a reason to deny them voting rights. I assume Wilson does not actually want to defend that conclusion, but the principle leads there, and if the principle leads there, it's a bad principle. Second, Wilson's argument goes through only if we accept that rights are exhaustively force rights. If there are moral rights, rights that hold regardless of whether you or anyone else can physically enforce them, then a great deal of the argument falls apart. One might think, for instance, that women have a moral right to vote, that it would be wrong to deny them political representation regardless of who has the upper hand in a hypothetical brawl. Wilson's framework simply has no place for this thought because it has no place for moral rights at all. Now, Kisin actually does push back along roughly these lines by gesturing at something like the moral right to political representation.
Well, I would imagine the point is to include the voice of half the population, which is naturally set on different priorities to those of men. And since we live in a society which is half female, it would be worthwhile to include their perspective in how we make decisions.
Why does voting
because it affects them as much as it affects us.
Wilson's reply is to bring up examples like prohibition. Even when women couldn't vote, women had significant cultural and political influence. So it's not as if their interests went totally unrepresented.
Are you aware that in the United States, we abolished alcohol?
for a period of time. I've seen some movies about how that went.
Who got that amendment passed?
I don't know.
Women.
Okay. Oh, no. If you want to have an
hang
argument
on,
about
hang
our disagreements with how women choose to vote.
No.
There's not
They
much
couldn't vote.
Oh, I see. That's what you're saying. Okay.
They couldn't vote.
But
But they still got that amendment passed.
okay.
The idea that women did not have influence or do not have influence or don't have moral influence on society because they can't vote is stupid.
But notice the inference. The inference seems to be, roughly, if a group lacks formal voting rights but still has some significant influence over political outcomes, then it doesn't need voting rights. This is just not a good inference. Lots of groups have some influence over political outcomes. The question is whether that influence is sufficient when it isn't formalized through a vote, particularly for a group that constitutes half the population. One might reasonably doubt whether, for example, she made her preferences known to her husband is a meaningful substitute for she cast her own ballot. And applying this standard to any other group makes the move look much worse. Would Wilson tell a racial or religious minority, for instance, that because they already have some degree of political or cultural influence, they don't need a vote? A few closing thoughts. First, credit where it's due. The discussion was civil. Nobody yelled at each other, nobody stormed off, nobody called each other names, there were minimal interruptions. Admittedly, all that's a low bar. But in the current media environment, even meeting a low bar is something, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. That said, Kisin and Foster could have pushed back on Wilson's arguments much harder. Several times throughout the interview, Wilson offered points that left themselves wide open for pressing follow-up questions or objections, but the follow-ups didn't get made. But the most important observation, to me, has to do with Wilson's manner of presentation. He speaks confidently, he gestures at deep philosophical foundations, he uses the vocabulary of metaethics. Yet it's all merely an aesthetic, a veneer meant to convey that the ideas have been carefully thought through, even though they in fact fall apart when exposed to any sustained philosophical scrutiny. Which raises the question, if Wilson's arguments so badly fail to count as serious philosophy, why have I bothered engaging with him? What's even the point of making a video like this? I see two reasons. First, even though Wilson deals in sophistry, many people will and do mistakenly take his ideas to be serious philosophy. They'll see the calm voice, the confident framing, the occasional fancy vocabulary, and they'll come away thinking that Wilson's arguments are the philosophically grown-up arguments. If those of us who think otherwise don't engage, what's to stop that impression from becoming entrenched? Second, this style of argument does not begin and end with Wilson. The kinds of moves he makes, the smug oversimplifications, the conflations of distinct points, the subtle straw-manning of his interlocutors' positions, and so on, are recurring features of pseudo-intellectualism more generally. If people can be helped to see how Wilson uses such maneuvers to his rhetorical advantage, they'll be better equipped to notice when these same maneuvers are used by someone else, perhaps in a slightly different costume. So what do you think? Do Wilson's arguments in fact succumb to the errors I've suggested they do? Or have I not given them a fair shake? If you have thoughts, questions, or objections you'd like to share, let me know in the comments. Also, if you liked this video, you might enjoy this other video, where I examine Trent Horn's version of the moral argument for the existence of God.